You are listening to Women's Running Stories, the podcast where exceptional women runners share inspirational stories about their running experiences.
I'm hoping to climb, there's this hike called Mailbox Peak and like a few others this summer. I plan to hike not with the same kind of intensity that I did in training for Kilimanjaro, but it's like it seems so normal and casual now that whereas before it was like, oh my gosh, I'm solo hiking and I'm doing this thing. And that doesn't mean that it's taken away any of like the excitement around it. It's just, anything can become normal. And it's like the more you do the thing or the more you're around the thing, and that's both good and bad, right? Like the same way that like white supremacy has been normalized, but anything that was once foreign or new can become, what is expected and what what doesn't shock you anymore. And that to me is hiking and also being around people who do things like this and following people on social media and learning from them. I suspect that there's going to be a lot more like quote unquote outdoor things in my life than necessarily running things in the future. My name is Alison Mariella Désir. I'm a mother, I'm an athlete, an activist, an author, and a whole bunch of other things, but I will stop there.
Yes, Alison Mariella Désir is many things, and now she is also a hiker and a mountain climber. And this is very new. Just last month, June of 2024, she summited Mount Kilimanjaro with a group of all Black women. And she is here to tell the incredible story. But before we hear more from Alison, I want to welcome you to Women's Running Stories. I am Cherie Louise Turner. I am the host and producer of this podcast. Thank you so much for being here. This is a terrific episode. This is Alison's second appearance on the podcast. The first time was back in October of 2022. That episode came out in conjunction with the release of her groundbreaking book, Running While Black, and it focused on her running story up to that time. Of course, I will link to that episode in the show notes. Now, in addition to being an author, as well as a mother, athlete, and activist, Alison is also a community builder, the TV host of the outdoor show Out and Back with Alison Mariella Désir. She's a disruptor, a trip leader, a public speaker, and she is so much more. And like I mentioned, she recently became a hiker and a mountain climber. And when I saw that she was preparing to climb Kilimanjaro, I thought, this is a story I would love to hear. So when she got back from this trip, I invited her back onto the podcast, and she very graciously agreed to come back and tell this story. Now, a few facts up top. Kilimanjaro is in Tanzania, in East Africa. It is the tallest mountain in Africa, and, something I just learned, it is the tallest freestanding peak in the world. Kilimanjaro tops out at just over 19,000 feet, so the altitude is real. For Alison, this was a new type of challenge. She lives in the Pacific Northwest these days, but that is a recent reality. She's originally from New York City, and while she has a lot of experience with running, including many marathons, hiking was not a pursuit that Alison had had much interest in. That has all changed. And that is the story she's here to tell, starting with how this expedition came into her life, all the way up to today. Upon returning to the U.S. after hiking in a group of all Black women, supported by an all-Black team of porters and guides, back to the reality of the running, trail, and outdoor communities here, where favoring whiteness continues to be the norm. This is especially true in the ultra and trail scene. For Alison, now with an even more full appreciation of how empowering and fulfilling outdoor experiences can be, she is as committed as ever to her work, creating space that centers and is welcoming to BIPOC runners and hikers. All right, so let's get to it. Let's hear the story of how Alison Mariella Désir has become a hiker and a mountain climber who has now summited Mount Kilimanjaro. And this story does start out with how this expedition came into Alison's life to begin with. Here to tell her story is Alison Mariella Désir.
So climbing Kilimanjaro was never at all on my radar. Climbing anything really wasn't on my radar. I only recently really learned about climbing, and that was because of an all-Black team that successfully summited Everest last summer. But before that, coming from New York, being a child of immigrants, like climbing mountains just really wasn't something that I had ever considered or thought about. But I received an email via my website in November or December of last year. And it was from this Black woman from Chicago who started her own guiding company with a guide in Tanzania. And she started the guiding company because she had climbed Kilimanjaro and had an amazing experience, but realized that many, if not most, of the guiding companies were foreign owned, didn't treat guides or porters with respect, didn't pay them as they should. And she thought, you know what? I love this experience. I want to do it in partnership with somebody from Tanzania and in a way that's equitable and that treats people fairly. So she reached out and she said that she was planning this all Black women's hike and wanted to know if I was interested. And at first it was difficult to get back in touch with her. Like, she would call, I would miss it, then she wouldn't be there when I called her, etc. And I thought, okay, maybe this whole thing is a scam and like, let me not waste any time. But finally we did connect and she shared more information about the trip. And it was exciting to me because this would be the first time since giving birth in 2019 that I would really have to train and put this above other aspects of my life, which is really hard when you have a small child. But the idea of being, that type of athlete again was exciting to me. The idea of doing it with all Black women. At the time, the hope was that we would set the world record for the most, American-born Black women to reach the summit. And so for all of those reasons, I said maybe, because I had to speak with my partner first. And as the weeks went by, I just couldn't get the idea out of my head. I think one piece of it was just an invitation, right? As I mentioned, climbing was not on my radar, Kilimanjaro wasn't on my radar. And I always say that, being inclusive really is more than just saying, like, show up if you want. It's about an invitation and feeling welcomed. And not only that, the fact that the founder of this company, the company is called Soraka Tours, was somebody who was also really concerned with issues of equity, meant to me that, like, sure, I could climb Kilimanjaro any other time, I suppose, but to do it under these conditions, like with somebody who had shared values with all Black women, whether we set the record or not, there's such a dearth of Black people, other than, of course, the Tanzanians who climb several thousands of times, that it could be really special, not just for me, but for other people. And so very early in January, I reached out and said yes, having no idea what it would really amount to. So my experience with hiking, I mean, I didn't have much experience with hiking. And part of it is that I didn't really, this sounds weird to say, but I didn't really think of hiking as like an activity. It's like sometimes I would end up hiking as I was trail running, but as its own activity where you set out to go on a hike, I didn't really see a need for it in my life. I also, again, lived in New York up until just 3 years ago. But having this plan to climb Kilimanjaro was just a perfect opportunity for me to explore all of the trails in Washington and even some in Oregon, which I would not have, if it were not for this trip, I don't think I would have maybe ever gone hiking in all of the places that I got to see.
Alison wasn't a hiker when she said yes to this trip, and now she was committed to being prepared to hike up to 19,000 feet on another continent with a group of strangers. With the trip only 6 months away in June, she got to work figuring out how to approach this challenge.
Well, I approach everything with intense scholarship. So the minute that I said yes, I started Googling nonstop. I then reached out to people who I knew in this space, and the minute I made it public, people reached out to me and put me in touch with people, which is really, I'm so thankful for my community. I'm so thankful for the people in my circle who care about me. Two of the people that I connected with, one, Philip Henderson, who was the lead guide for the All Black Summit to Everest, and he has led lots of trips to Kilimanjaro. He's a professional climber, has been for the last, I want to say, 50 years. He's a Black man. And then another person who I was connected with is Saray Kumalo. I'm not sure if that's how you pronounce her name, but she is South African, and she was the first South African or first African born woman to climb all of the 7 summits. So these were two of the people that I was connected with. And man, the insight that they gave me was so powerful. I'll share two things really quickly. So one, when I was talking to Phil Henderson, and again, this was really early on, so I hadn't really even gotten into training. He told me that a lot of people underestimate Kilimanjaro. They say it's just a hike, right? In quotes, because yeah, there's no mountaineering, there's no equipment, you're hiking. But he said, still, I think the overall number is like only 60 to 70% of people actually reach the summit. And it's because they underestimate it. And he said, you don't want to climb Kilimanjaro feeling exhausted every day, like napping, complaining. You want to climb every day and feel good and hang out with people and laugh and share stories and really soak up the experience. And so he said, train your butt off. And then the thing that Saray Kumalo told me was that, and this seems like a small thing, but she said, start training with your poles, because poles will make your life easier. What's so funny is that, using poles in my head was something that you did only when it was really, really hard, or that people who weren't as fit did, right? Like these are the ideas that I have in my mind, that I don't know exactly where they came from, but these are things that I've picked up. And so to hear it from Saray, I remember the first time that I tried to use the poles, like my poles were actually broken. And I was like, wow, good thing I'm trying this now, because what a crisis it would be if this happened on Kilimanjaro. But it was a moment, and this is, having an open mind is something that really served me well on the trip, listening to people and their expertise, even if it doesn't sound immediately right in my head. So fundamentally, I really learned about, the power of respecting expertise and those who came before you.
Alison put the advice of experts into practice and she got to training, much of which she was doing on her own.
So solo hiking for me was important because, well, I have a 4-year-old son, and both me and my partner work. And so the idea that all of my hikes would be with my partner or with a friend, of course I have friends, but once you have a child, like you really only, talk to your friends every now and then. So the idea that the only time I would be able to hike would be with another person felt really restrictive and wouldn't work with the kind of schedule that I was looking at, where I was planning to do, like 2 to 3 long hikes a week and sometimes more than that. So that's one piece of it. The other piece of it was that Philip and Saray and other people had told me that Kilimanjaro really, certainly it's physical because you're moving your body, but it's really mental. It's about pushing your body, getting your body to move when you don't have enough oxygen and when you're exhausted and you'd rather be doing something else. So this mental challenge, I felt like, so I could approach it by hiking solo. And that to me was a scary endeavor as a, Black woman in the trails by myself, sometimes in places that didn't have reception. So I got, GPS phone, but those mental challenges to me were how I could prepare for a different set of mental challenges that I might face on the hike. And initially it felt strange. It felt uncomfortable, but the more I did it, the more I came to feeling like, I deserve to be here. Like imagine depriving myself from this experience because of what other people might think of me being there. And I do think that the kind of, when you have that confidence, it doesn't make you, invincible, but it does, I think, change how other people see you, right? I wasn't like this vulnerable, poor thing And again, I'm not saying that anybody who is attacked is that, but I do think that shifting my mindset allowed me to really feel like I belong there and enjoy my experience hiking alone. So the more I hiked, the more powerful I realized it was or is as a form of exercise, in several different ways. One, because I got to see like the most beautiful places that I would not have been able to see were it not for hiking. Two, I found that hiking was actually helping me become a stronger runner, to the point that I was running maybe once a week, but because of my long hikes, when I would run, I felt so strong. And that's that's a moment when I realized, though hiking might feel quote unquote easier, even though I was gaining lots of elevation with each climb, like 10,000 feet of elevation a week, but relative to running, which is for me just feels harder, is just feels more difficult. Hiking, there was a sense of ease to it, but the gains were huge, right? I found that my legs were so much stronger, my endurance was so much stronger, and I realized, like, wow, like, do I even want to run anymore? Like, I'm getting all these benefits from hiking, and I'm able to do it at a pace where I can really take in what's around me. I had almost like a complete 180 shift in terms of what activity I saw was central to my identity. I think the biggest and most important hike that I went on, that of course I would not have been able to do had I not done all the prior hikes, is hiking Mount St. Helens. And also, this was not something that was on my radar. And I have to say, finding out about Mount St. Helens actually came under tragic circumstances. It was like the weekend before, it was like, I forget the date, but in March or April, a very famous climber had climbed Mount St. Helens. Apparently, he had climbed it like hundreds of times, but there was a very large cornice that he didn't see, and he went over into the crater. And what makes this story even more tragic is that apparently they could see evidence that he was able to. So he left his bag and then he walked to what he thought was a safe part, but ended up falling into the crater. Had he had his bag, he would have arguably survived to the morning. But so he managed to climb up almost to the very top of where the cornice was and fell again. So just a very tragic story. This came across my Instagram feed and I was like, oh my goodness, like this is terrible. And also, what is Mount St. Helens? Like, why do people climb things like this? And then this must be the algorithm. But then literally the very next post was a friend of mine who organizes trips in the outdoors, particularly for women of color, was organizing a trip to climb Mount St. Helens. And I was like, what? Like, why would I climb something deadly? Right. And I don't mean to make light of this. I'm just sharing how these things, how this came about. But then, of course, I went to Google and did a lot of research and just learned that, of course, tragic things do happen, and but that this man had climbed Mount St. Helens so many times because it was an incredible place, and so I decided to climb with this group. And man, Kilimanjaro was difficult when you got to the summit, but Mount St. Helens, I think, is up there with with Kilimanjaro. It took us 12 hours total. The whole thing was snowy, and there were parts that like you took a step and would slide down, took a step and would slide down. But doing that and facing my fear of heights and getting that long time on my feet was, invaluable when it came to just, again, like the mindset, knowing I could do difficult things, knowing I could be on my feet for that long, and knowing that I could do something that I was terrified of. All of that helped me when it came to like the mental conditioning I needed for Kilimanjaro. Yeah. So as I said, Philip Henderson told me very early, to do the most. And so in addition to hiking outside, I also did a lot of walking on my treadmill at, the most incline I could, at 15 incline. And I remember at first that feeling hard. And now, I mean, I still am doing it. I still, every day I try to do like 30 to 45 minutes of incline walking on my treadmill because it is such a good workout. In addition to that, I got connected to this company called Hypoxico. And Hypoxico, I mean, it's just what the name is, right? That helps you create a hypoxic environment, an environment with less oxygen. So they sponsored me in providing me with an altitude sleeping situation. I forget exactly what it's called, but essentially, there's like this tented part of it that you sleep in, and there is a tube, and the tube. I don't know if the tube pushes in air, it sucks out air, but essentially it allows you to create an environment that is akin to being at altitude. So I started at 5,000 feet. And what you do is every night you go up every night you have a good night's sleep, you go up 500 feet of elevation. And, for the last 3 weeks before Kilimanjaro, I was sleeping at 11,000, 12,000 feet and feeling great. And what was really cool about that is, sleeping in a hypoxic environment, it essentially causes your body will adapt, right? So your body will start producing more red blood cells and EPO naturally. And so then when I would go out and train or go for a run, man, I felt like I was like a superhero because everything felt so easy. And I do think that, like, you never know when you do a whole mix of things in your training what is making the most impact. But I do know that this sleeping at altitude is a huge part of why I was successful.
Alison would come to find out that the training she had done was, in fact, spot on. But of course, going into the Kilimanjaro hike, she had no way of being certain about that. She was embarking on the unknown.
The thing is that you don't know you're prepared until you're done with a thing, right? Like, I felt like I had done a lot of training. There was actually the last run I was supposed to do was this. I was aiming to do a 50K, and I got blisters. Like, I actually had food poisoning. That was the first time I had ever taken a shit in the woods. And it was gross. But now that that's happened, I feel like, I can go through anything. But so that didn't leave me feeling like I was really that prepared. But again, yeah, I mean, like, what you've done, but you will only really know if you're adequately prepared once the thing is over. So another piece of advice that I heard from Saray was that even if you feel like you are in the best shape of your life, go in the back, right? Like, because it's the people who are overconfident at the beginning, who use too much energy at the beginning, who end up not summiting. And unfortunately, that actually did happen to a person. They were leading the entire time, and just like the accumulation of all of the really wasted energy and other issues that come from when you waste your energy, right? Like inability to sleep and et cetera, held her back. And she's an incredible person. So if she is listening to this, you know that I love you. In terms of other concerns, I mean, one of my biggest concerns was the bathroom. And this is totally a first world problem. But for me, like, anything having to do with bathrooms or just, those things just like freaks me out. And I knew that I was going to have my period. And so just trying to wrap my mind around, like, how was I going to deal with all of this on the mountain? And then, of course, finally, like, meeting all these women for the first time. And I had a journal, and I only wrote my journal twice. Once, like, the day I got there, and then after I summited. And the day I got there, I wrote, I don't know if I'm actually going to connect with any of these women, but it will be pleasant, and I'll, make it through having internal conversations with myself. And by the end of the trip, of course, like, man, we were having such a good time, and I really enjoyed being around these women. But yeah, there's always the unknown of, like, how's it going to be doing something this difficult with people who you don't know and maybe can't trust. Yeah, so the thing that is unique about experiences like this is that the difficulty of it, and sort of the, like, knowing everybody knowing just how bananas this is does lead to a sense of connection. And I would say that by day two, we all started sharing more of ourselves. And I mean, I don't think we intended to. I just think, like, man, you're walking for 6 hours a day. Like, if you have to pee or poop while you're walking, like, you're just going behind a rock. Like, you know, eventually things that you're thinking in your head start to come out. And so there was just this closeness that started forming. Also, we're all Black women, which meant that every single person who was part of our trip was Black, right? Like, obviously the porters and guides were Black. And there was such a respect and like mutual love between us, the porters and the guides, because they were so thankful that we were there, right? Like, they were so happy to see Black women doing this. Of course, they're happy when, white people do it too, but it's a rarity that there are Black people who come to Tanzania to summit Kilimanjaro. So yeah, it was, I mean, very quickly it was like the altitude sickness we had was like a loopiness where we just were saying and doing ridiculous, funny things, and bonding in a way that I absolutely did not anticipate when I wrote my first journal entry. Yeah, so I first went to Africa when I was in college. I took a trip to Ghana my senior year, and I was there for almost 2 weeks, and I did not want to come back. I had such a great time. And it was one of the first times, I mean, I had spent a lot of time traveling in the Caribbean with my parents, but I guess it was my first time in Africa, and that people there saw me and embraced me like I was one of them, right? And the same thing happened actually with this trip to Tanzania, where the first day, one of the guides asked me if I was African. And to me, that is a huge compliment because I'm obviously part of the African diaspora, and part of that is a disconnection from where we were once from and from our people and our culture. And I do know that the Haitian side of my family, our descendants come from Benin in West Africa. But this idea of being seen as possibly one of them is a really powerful and meaningful connection to me. So I'd been to Ghana in senior high school. Then, shortly after graduating college, I went to Egypt, and that was an amazing trip because I always thought of like the pyramids as being these like far off things in the middle of quote unquote nowhere, but you can actually be in Cairo and see the pyramids. So it's like this blend of, ancient and modern, which was really cool. And yeah, and then this trip to Tanzania. So my third time. And I don't know really much of anything about politics in Tanzania, but the president is a woman. And so there was this Black woman's face everywhere around the country. And I just thought about how that could never happen in the United States. And it also was just, I guess, it offers a sense of relief when, I mean, no doubt there are things that stood out about me and others that we were American, right? Like from the way we dressed at times to even just the way that we like carried ourselves in space, because Americans have like a particular way of carrying themselves. But to be able to be sort of like lost in a group and not stand out is a really powerful feeling that we don't get in the United States, and that we don't often get in the United States, and that white people take for granted. Yeah, and it is so refreshing and also really cool to be able to connect even where there was a language barrier, because many of the all of the guides spoke English, many of the porters spoke English, not necessarily like, fluently, but there was just still like we could connect on so many things on music. I mean, we listened to Afro beats and their music, and they listened to hip hop and our music. And there was just like this vibe, and it was so comforting to be around all Black people. And there were moments actually on the trip when we would see, or I shouldn't say we, all speak for myself, when I would see another group that was white people, that it was actually like striking, because they seemed out of place.
Alison was in an environment where she found connection and comfort, which set her up well to tackle the difficult challenge of a huge climb. And this is when the training kicked in. Immediately, she recognized the benefits of having learned to use hiking poles.
For me, I found that climbing Kilimanjaro with poles almost made it like it almost felt like I wasn't doing the full amount of work, right? Because poles, help you summit and come down. And other people on my trip who had not trained with poles, when it got really difficult for them and they needed to take out the poles, it was like watching like a baby giraffe, right? Like learning how to use a piece of equipment at the crucial time when you need it.
Alison recognized how important it had been to follow the advice of those who came before, even in light of her own doubts, like back when she'd originally been told to train with poles. So she unquestionably adhered to the advice she'd been given to hike in the back, regardless of the fact that she knew she was really fit.
But so yeah, I went to the back. That first day, I was hiking in the back. Second day, I was in the slower group. Third day, same thing. But what I started to realize was I'm not sore. I'm not tired. Like I'm sleepy because I wasn't able to get good sleep and because I was freezing at night. Like in the middle of the night, I was taking these pills called Diamox that help you to acclimate, and they also cause you to pee nonstop. So in the middle of the night, you'd have to like get out of your tent, freezing cold to use the bathroom. Climbing Kilimanjaro wasn't easy, but I was prepared for it. And it's because I learned to listen to people who had the expertise. If my guide told me to do something, I was going to do it. Other people would question the guides and it would catch up with them later, right? But yeah, like by the time we got to summit day, which was the fourth day, I knew that I was in good shape because I had been feeling strong, hadn't been feeling sore, tired, etc. But I also knew that summit day was the hardest day of all. Yeah, so our group had a range of abilities and ages and sizes and all of that. And the guides were committed to giving us all the best opportunity to summit. So what they ended up doing was rather than everybody, typically like people will start summit night at like 11 or midnight so that you reach the summit at the sunrise and it's beautiful. But what they did is they had one group start at midnight, the slower group start at midnight, and then the second group was going to start at 4 a.m. And the hope was that we would end up meeting at the summit. So the first group took off, we were the second group, and one of my friend who ended up not being able to summit, she was not feeling good from the start, right? And she was like almost like she was passing out. She just unable to stand up straight, which is what happens to your body when you're not acclimating, right? When you don't have enough oxygen, that's how your body acts. Like that's a natural response. So within the first like hour or so, she had to be given oxygen and got taken down. And so that was that for me. That was a bummer isn't even the word for it. Like I felt so badly that she wasn't going to be able to be part of this experience because I care so much about her and I knew how much this meant to her. But you also, when you see somebody like that, like you just know that it's dangerous to keep going. What I really liked about our summit, even though we didn't do the traditional thing of like getting to the peak at sunrise, we were able to actually see the entire sunrise, which was beautiful. And we weren't freezing cold for most of the time. I would say that I felt pretty good up until like 18,500 or 18,700 feet. And then I started to get this like slight pressure in my head. And there's no real way to explain it unless you've been at altitude, but it feels like somehow like the inside of your head is pushing against your cranium and trying to like break out of it. So, my guides were helpful in terms of like giving me medication and then giving me glucose, which they have this glucose powder that of course we made like off-color jokes about snorting glucose. But, and then I was like, fine, like it was just this like annoyance that I was feeling. And I reached reaching the summit is Gilman's Point, right? Like then beyond that, it's a mile to Uhuru Peak. And some people reach the summit and don't get to the peak. And so when I got to the summit, that's when I was like, oh, okay, this is not feeling great. And there were still a lot of hills, which like blew my mind because I'm like, we're literally at the top of Kilimanjaro. We've reached the summit. Like, why is there more climbing? And then I would say like about, then the terrain started to shift and you could see the glaciers and there was like frozen snow on the path. And there was this one moment that I remember distinctly where it felt like all of the energy was zapped out of my body. And I now know that that was the moment that I got my period. I didn't know it at the time, but it literally was like somebody I don't know, like had one of those Ghostbusters things and like sucked my life force out of me. And I started crying and I was like, man, I'm so tired. Like I can't move anymore. And again, the guides the guides, porters, they themselves are exhausted because they're dealing with us for 4 days, right? And now they have to take care of us while we're at the top. But they were like, listen, you are so close. Like, we're not letting you, like, you're gutting to the peak. And so they helped me like up the final hill. And then I was able to walk like super slowly to the peak. If you have a moment to go to my Instagram, just look at how slowly we were moving. I can now laugh about it. But when I tell you that felt so difficult at the time, like that's the best we could do. And then I took some pictures. I remember saying that I would rather get pregnant and give birth to quadruplets than do that ever again. I don't know if that's still true. But I had to leave. I left after like 5 minutes. It's just like the pressure was too much and I felt really nauseous. But the good thing is on the descent is that the lower you go, the better you feel. So by the time I got down to like 17,000 feet, I felt like myself again. And, again, felt tired, felt better that I wasn't at such high altitude, but I didn't feel like broken or like I needed to lay down for hours. I was really proud of my fitness and my, sort of mental strength. I mean, I knew even when I was like really feeling badly, like I said, I knew that I was gonna finish, right? Because it's like that saying, like, I didn't come this far to come this far. So I knew that I was gonna reach the peak, but it felt like it would take the rest of my life to get there. You know what I mean? And then like once you're actually there, I mean, I did still feel nauseous and there was still pressure on my head, but then you're sort of like, oh my God, like that's it. You know what I mean? Like, and I guess it's like the cliche, like it's not about the destination, it's about the journey. But like then really like the minute I got down the mountain, then it's like the experience, like you just finished it. And as soon as you finish it, it's like, it's already starting to like evaporate. You know what I mean? It's like when you wake up from a dream and it's like, you're trying to like remember the pieces of it, but they're already leaving you. And so I wanted to make sure that like I journaled and that I, took video of myself because I wanted to try to have the most like crystallized memory of the feeling of doing it. And the feeling of knowing that like all the stuff that I did like is what got me here, you know what I mean? And all the people, the guides and the porters, I mean, they really are there to save your life, right? Like listening to them can be life or death. People die from acute altitude sickness on Kilimanjaro, right? Like people don't reach the summit. And so knowing just how much they cared about us and how special the moment was to do it with all Black women, yeah, I wanted to try to hold on to that for as long as I could. I think that this trip has really, well, it's dangerous on the one hand because it's made me aware or made me feel like I can do anything. And I say that's dangerous because it's like, who knows what I'll do next, right? Dangerous in terms of my wallet, dangerous in terms of like taking up a lot of my time, but something that I never thought that I would do. Like, okay, and I don't mean to compare here, but running a marathon to me was once like the impossible. And now I'm like, I can climb mountains, you know what I mean? So I actually immediately came home and started looking for all non-technical mountains and volcanoes that I could climb. And just looking at, and I didn't understand. I actually, before I left for Kilimanjaro, I found myself watching all of these movies like about Everest. And I even watched the movie about this climber who has been accused of sexual assault, who I think climbed all 14 peaks in a year. But I started watching all these films about people who wanted to push themselves and climb big things. And in my mind, I'm like, what is the point of all of this? Like, what are these people trying to prove? And for me, in no way am I trying to like race for the fastest time or do anything like, you know, particularly extraordinary. But I do understand the desire to, one, see the world from an amazing perspective, like the top of the mountain, and that it's not just about that. It's about the kind of like discipline and confidence and just like time to yourself, all of the things that you get from the preparation of this thing, all the people that you meet, all the people that you like work with and are in community with. Like, I would imagine that's a large part of why people do these things. It's like, it's so much more than just, the expedition.
Alison had done it. She had summited Mount Kilimanjaro, and in the process, she'd discovered a love of hiking and a strong interest in climbing mountains. She had a deeper personal understanding of how empowering and rewarding time spent challenging yourself on the trails can be. And then she returned to the United States, and she was reminded once again of the distinct lack of real progress being made in the trail and ultra side of running when it comes to diversity, equity, and inclusion. In particular, this reminder came in the form of a recently published article in the popular trail and ultra magazine I Run Far. The article is titled Women in Trail Running and Ultra Running: Perspectives on the Challenges and Progress Toward Equity. Something that stands out about this article is that not only was it written by two white women, but all of the people sourced for the article are also only white women.
Yeah, it's really discouraging to do something like so amazing and feel so accomplished and then come back to the United States and just deal with more of the same. Every year for the past, I don't know, 4 or 5 years, I feel like I've been saying the same thing around the trail and ultra running community, also the road running community, but the trail and ultra running community more so, of just being, unserious about equity, of really just centering white people and white feminism. And it seems like every year this information is a shock to people. Every year, white women are, offended that anybody else would want to be included in the conversation. And one, it's exhausting, but two, it does make me even more passionate about the work that I do that centers Black, Indigenous, and other people of color, right? Like, it affirms that the spaces that I'm creating are important, are necessary, and that might actually be our only means of progress, right? That this pursuit of trying to get into these white spaces because we, not me personally, but because they're thought of to be prestigious. And I honestly see prestigious as being a synonym for, whiteness and exclusivity. But rather than fighting so hard to get into places where people don't want us, just creating our own places, right? Continuing to create our own places, because that really is what my life has been dedicated to. But what's frustrating is that white women in this case are the ones who have access to institutional power and resources, right? So while they continue to advocate for this narrow vision of what it means to be a woman, the rest of us are left out of the conversation and left without those same resources, right? Because often this is then like, conversations like this are distorted as though I'm making these personal attacks on these women. Like, I am talking about the access to power that they have and the way that they're creating paths only for themselves. They could be wonderful women. They could be really fun and really cool. That's immaterial. I'm talking about the way that they're not, creating space for all of us. And the thing is, like, of course, I'm also somebody who knows that the personal is political, but like, this is not an attack on you because I hate you and because you're mean and because you're stupid. Like, no, right? Like, that's not actually what's happening here. And if you receive it as such, that really is something that you need to like consider deeply about yourself. But no, this is about the issues. Like, you have said publicly that you are committed to equity, and you have put out all of this information publicly, but then you refuse to continue the discourse publicly. Any critiques have to be done in private, in the right tone, with enough deference. Like, no, that's not how this works. I wish that they would say, you know what, man, well, of course we're not getting this right because we're only talking to people who have a similar shared experience. Let's invite more people into the room and then we can move forward, right? But they're not even saying that, right? Like, they're insisting that what they're doing matters more or most, and we just have to wait our turn. You know what I mean? And that's what the problem is. That's why we're upset, because I mean, we're upset for a lot of reasons, but one of them is because there's not even an ability to like reflect and see the possibility for error or improvement in what they're doing. It's just like, this is the way it should be done, and you're going to hold women, quote unquote, women back if you try to do this work intersectionally. I joked about this, but maybe there's a brand that's listening to this that I would love to go on tour to all of these races. I don't expect to be welcomed. I don't expect people to be nice to me, but I want these conversations to happen at Western States, High Lonesome 100, Leadville 100, all of those races that attract only the same type of people, or people who are mostly looking to be deferential in person. Like, it's all good when you post online, but then when you get there in person and have an opportunity to have a conversation or hold people accountable, like, you're just happy to participate in the race. So I'm putting that out there in the world. And the idea is like, yes, this would be uncomfortable conversations. There would be confrontation in the sense that we would be confronting each other with opposing ideas, but then maybe we could actually like work through this.
A call to action so that maybe we can finally work through this. These are conversations I would love to see come to fruition. Alison is a terrific public speaker, and I have no doubt that she would lead very dynamic, thought-provoking, change-making conversations. Conversations that we really need to have. So while this does bring us to the end of Alison Mariella Désir's story in this episode, there is clearly much more to come. I want to thank Alison for coming on the podcast once again. Thank you, Alison, for telling your story here and also for everything you do in the running and outdoor world. You know I appreciate you and the work that you do. Now, if you have not read Alison's book, Running While Black, please do. I'll provide a link to Alison's website where you can learn more about her and find out ways to buy her book. And Alison is very active on social media, so you can follow her there and keep up with everything she is up to. Her television show, her workshops, her outdoor trips, her speaking engagements, her outdoor adventures, all of it. I'll also provide a link to her hashtag AMDClimbsKili, which features content around her Kilimanjaro climb. You can also find those posts in her regular Instagram feed. And I will link to Soraka Tours, which is the guide company she went to Kilimanjaro with. And I will provide a link to the first time that Alison was featured on Women's Running Stories back in October of 2022. Finally, I will provide a link to the I Run Far article that was mentioned in this story. And that does bring me to the end of this episode of Women's Running Stories. I am Cherie Louise Turner. I am the host and producer of this podcast. Thank you so much for being here. I always appreciate you listening. I also appreciate you sharing the podcast with other people who you know would enjoy it too. That's going to be a wrap for now. Until next Tuesday, I do wish you healthy, joyful strides forward. Women's running. Women's running stories.
Hear Her Sports is a podcast for everyone who loves stories by and about women striving to improve and make a difference in their lives. I am your host, Elizabeth Emery, a former professional cyclist. In every episode, I introduce a female athlete or woman in the business of sport through a thoughtful conversation about who they are and the terrific work they're doing. My guests and I explore the glorious and frustrating issues in sports, history, equity, training, nutrition, and so much more. Join us for inspiration, for community, and for love of being a strong, athletic woman.